In every event I've gone to, one of the reasons has also always been networking, to forge meaningful networks and partnerships. So I want to take this opportunity because I've seen, since I got in the room, a lot of you are seated straight-faced looking in front. Yet on your left side there's someone. And I think it's only human that you get to know who you're seated next to. You never know your destiny. I want you to turn to the person seated next to you. Tell them good morning in your language. Just tell them good morning in your language. Exchange cards if you have. Take their number. Tell them we'll keep the conversation going later. I want you to connect meaningfully. Wonderful. So I know among the languages you had, there was Mwaramutse. So Mwaramutse mwese. Nago ndikuvumva. Mwaramutse. Mumeze neza. Chane. Ko mucheye chane gucho. Musa neza chane. So if you're seeing me for the first time, if you're hearing this voice for the first time, as always, my name is Eugene Anangwe. I am a broadcast journalist, and I made Rwanda my home for the last, cumulatively, almost 17 years. I'm originally from Kenya, but I moved to Rwanda in 2008, at a time when I was just finishing college. I was studying journalism. And when I told my family that I was moving to Rwanda, I've gotten a job there, everybody, everything they knew about Rwanda that time was the tragedy of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. There was no other story that anybody else knew about Rwanda. In fact, there were even sometimes when your parent is threatening to beat you up, they would tell you, Ntaku Rwanda. And when I grew up, I got to understand what they meant. That they would give you a beating, a thorough beating, to the level of what happened, sadly, in the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis. Over the years, I've witnessed Rwanda transform right in my eyes. I've seen it all. So everything I'll be saying here as your Masters of Ceremony and the moderator is something I've witnessed personally. So when I moved to Rwanda, I went to work for a radio station called Contact FM. It was among the first private radios. And throughout that period, I stayed in Rwanda until 2019. And I served in different capacities, including getting the role of the country manager of CNBC Africa and Forbes Africa. And I came back to Kenya to launch from the scratch a popular TV station here called TV47. And since Rwanda is home, I kept hearing the voice, Anangwe. Actually, they call me Mugisha these days. And Bujen. We need you back. So I went back. And over the times, I've driven conversations around Pan-Africanism. And these conversations are very dear to my heart. And so today is a moment of reflection for us to try and look back at 30 years since the tragedy, since the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis. We see a transformed nation that has risen from the ashes. But a lot of us do not know the foundation of this. What led to this? What happened? What was the turn of events? We'll also ask the tough questions right here. And I want us to be able to leave this room refreshed, educated, to a point where we are able to fully understand when we say never again genocide. We mean it deep from our hearts. And so in this program, I want just to mention some housekeeping rules. If you need to relieve yourself, there is an exit. When you take that exit, please take your right turn, and you'll be able to see the gents and the ladies. Later on, we'll have refreshments, and it is also going to be taking place outside. When you exit, it's going to be on the right, but at the balcony. Allow me to bring to the podium our first speaker, who is going to at least give us perspective on even why we are here today, at the invitation of the Rwanda High Commission right here in Rwanda. And so please join me in putting our hands together in welcoming His Excellency Ambassador Martin Ngoga, the High Commissioner of Rwanda here in Kenya. Let's appreciate him as he comes to give us the welcoming remarks. I always say energy until he gets here. Come on, let's keep going. More energy for Balozi. Karibu sana.
Rakoze cyane Eugene. 17 years, such a long time. You must have learned Kinyarwanda by now. Distinguished panelists, excellencies, ambassadors, high commissioners, and members of the diplomatic corps, defense attachés here present, esteemed members of academia, fellow Rwandans, friends of Rwanda, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I would like to start by welcoming you all to this important conference on the 30th commemoration of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. I would also like to extend my sincere gratitude to our distinguished panelists who are here with us today for generously accepting my invitation to speak during this important event. Today, we gather to discuss one of the most disturbing chapters in the human history, the genocide against the Tutsi. The genocide against the Tutsi, which took place in Rwanda in 1994, remains a painful and haunting reminder of the depth to which humanity can sink. Over a span of 100 days, approximately 1 million innocent people were senselessly slaughtered simply because of their ethnic identity. It is crucial that we remember this genocide, not only to honor the memories of the victims, but also to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated. By understanding the causes that led to this genocide, we can work towards preventing similar horrors from occurring elsewhere in the world. This conference, therefore, holds great significance as it provides us with an opportunity to come together, exchange ideas, and to reflect upon one of the darkest chapters in human history, and to collectively strive towards a future built on understanding, reconciliation, and peace. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, today's conference provides us a platform to dive into the root causes of genocide, to examine the systemic failures that allowed such unimaginable violence to take hold, and to reaffirm our commitment to preventing future atrocities. It is also an occasion to honor the victims and survivors, to extract from this senseless slaughter the lessons that can still be learned to prevent genocides in the future. It is our moral obligation to ensure that the voices of the innocent lives that perished during the genocide are heard, their stories are told, and their legacy is preserved for future generations. We must honor their memories by working tirelessly to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again in Rwanda or elsewhere in the world. Education, remembrance, and justice are crucial elements in preventing genocide and promoting reconciliation. Education is vital in raising awareness about the consequences of hatred and discrimination. By teaching younger generations about the horrors of the past, which happens to be the main objective of this conference, we can instill in them a sense of responsibility to build a more inclusive and tolerant society. This conference, therefore, serves to educate us all on the atrocities committed during the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, while providing space for dialogue, reflection, and understanding. In this respect, I would like to encourage members of the academia here present, particularly faculties of social sciences and history, to provide students with in-depth courses on the genocide against the Tutsi and to give them appropriate support to understand this phenomenon. It is equally important that other internationally recognized genocides are taught globally, so that the younger generations have sufficient knowledge to understand what happened in the past with the goal of preventing other atrocities from occurring. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, while we commemorate the victims, we must also acknowledge the failure of the international community in adequately responding to the genocide against the Tutsi. We must learn from this failure and commit ourselves to preventing similar atrocities in the future. As we shall soon be hearing from the panelists, justice is the cornerstone in preventing genocide and ensuring accountability for the perpetrators. It is therefore imperative for the international community to support efforts to prosecute and to bring to justice those who orchestrated and carried out the genocide against the Tutsi. History has taught us that genocides are not born overnight. They stem from a deep-seated prejudices, discrimination, and a systematic dehumanization of a particular group. In Rwanda, this process was fueled by years of injustice, segregation, and hate ideology, which created fertile ground for the seeds of hatred to take root. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, as we renew our resolve to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again, we are seeing dangerous trends of rising hate speech and intolerance in many parts of the world. Particularly troubling is the current widespread proliferation of hate speech and incitement to violence. Things that were very clearly present in Rwanda immediately before the genocide they are an affront to our values and threaten human rights, social stability, and peace. However, as we reflect upon the causes, we must also acknowledge the incredible resilience and courage demonstrated by the survivors of the genocide and by Rwanda as a nation. Their stories of survival, forgiveness, and determination to build their lives and their country are a testament to the power of the human spirit. For Rwanda, the journey from darkness to light has been so long and odious, but it is a journey marked by the unwavering resolve by our leadership and a people determined to rebuild, reconcile, and to forge a path towards healing and renewal. Rwanda has achieved the unthinkable feat of getting back to its feet after having lived through a terrible disaster and almost being wiped out. In this respect, this conference is not only a learning experience, but also a manifestation of extraordinary milestone of survival and resilience of a nation. As I conclude, let us remember that our responsibility does not end with this conference. It is our duty to carry the lessons learned here into our daily lives and work towards a world free from hatred, discrimination, and violence. We must stand together, united, to promote peace, justice, and reconciliation. I thank you for your attention and welcome to the conference.
Another round of applause to Balozi, please. Thank you, Balozi. Mu Kinyarwanda kinoze bavuga ngo akanyoni katagurutse nikamenya iyo gweze. So I want to urge all of us today, let us not remain in our cocoons. Let us try to learn as much as we can. And that is what is going to happen today. I want to set the tone for our panel today. Balozi has alluded to it, but I want us to hear from a man who actually says it as it is. I think we've watched him, we've seen him, we've streamed his speeches. And he holds no prisoners. I always say this because he will tell you as it is. And of course, I believe that Africa and Pan-Africanism runs in his DNA because he speaks with a lot of passion for this great continent. When he speaks, the world listens. Ladies and gentlemen, the founder and chairman of the PLO Lumumba Foundation, Professor PLO Lumumba. Let's give him a round of applause.
Your Excellency, the Ambassador of Rwanda to Kenya, Your Excellencies, Ambassadors and High Commissioners, friends of goodwill, and the citizens of Rwanda and different parts of the world gathered this morning here in Nairobi, Kenya. Good morning. Before I make my remarks, if only to help us appreciate the enormity of this day, permit me to ask all of us to rise for 30 seconds and in a moment of reflection remember what happened 30 years ago. May you rise. Thank you very much. "30 years ago today, the world was silent for 100 days as brother rose against brother and sister rose against sister in Rwanda, in what has become known as the genocide against the Tutsis. When the pogrom was taking place, Rwanda had neighbors. They said nothing, and they did nothing. The international community was alive and well. They said nothing and did nothing. There were embassies accredited to Rwanda. There were ambassadors present in Kigali. They said nothing and did nothing. They were eloquent in their silence for 100 days. And when the conscience of the world had been pricked after 100 days, when the count was done, it is never exact, but it is estimated that nearly 1 million people were dead. The world was never the same again. Those who were observing the situation wrote the obituary of Rwanda, and it was thought that Rwanda would never rise again. Today we gather here to commemorate those who lost their lives, those who are maimed, those who are mentally scarred. And we are reminding ourselves of man's capacity to visit humanity to fellow man. But we are also gathered here to remind ourselves of man's capacity to do good. It is a paradox that we are capable of such evil and also capable of good. So today, we remember the events of 30 years ago to remind us that we must be eternally vigilant, to remind us that conventions, the declarations, the treaties, in and of themselves do not change man. Because in 1994, when the pogrom was taking place against the Tutsi in Rwanda, the Genocide Convention was alive and well. The world had met in 1948 and said that we needed a convention to ensure that there was no genocide. But even in the presence of that convention, we still visited pain against fellow man. So when we gather here today, we are reminding ourselves that we as human beings must never forget that eternal vigilance is critical, that we may preserve dignity amongst men. Nobody needs to be told of the pain that hatred occasions to man. We must remind ourselves that if we are not eternally vigilant, then we are likely to repeat the things that harm us. We are here to remind ourselves that many times what we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. Because if it were the case that we learned something from history, what happened 30 years ago would not have happened. The history of humanity is replete with examples of the pain that we have visited upon each other. We can count many wars. We can count many genocides that have been perpetrated. We can count the number of wars that are going on even as we speak. The world is not at ease. But yet, we can never afford the luxury of giving up. We can never afford the luxury of despair. We cannot afford the luxury of hiding our heads in the sand like the ostrich does. We cannot afford the luxury of using our energies to perpetrate evil. We cannot afford the luxury of talking justice while we occasion injustice. We cannot afford the luxury of reminding ourselves that we must always strive to do that which is good and right. We cannot afford the luxury of doing nothing when we know that the perpetrators of evil are always in the business of planning the next evil. We cannot afford the luxury of being comfortable, because even as we sit here, there are those who are planning to visit evil. Even as we sit here, there are those whose conscience are seared and they do not care if they cause death or pain. So today we are gathered here to remind ourselves that we must never repeat what happened 30 years ago. We are sitting here to remind ourselves that it happened in Rwanda and it can happen anywhere. Indeed, if we take a little time and cast our eyes in different parts of the world, it is self-evident that man seldom learns. Look at Europe, see what is happening. Look at the Middle East, see what is happening. Look at Sudan, see what is happening. Look at Central African Republic, see what is happening. Look at Cameroon, see what is happening. Look at Eastern Congo, see what is happening. Yet Rwanda teaches us a lesson that even when we have been placed in the muck and mire of confusion, we can, like the phoenix before us, rise and begin to tell a different story. the story of never forgetting the pain that was visited upon us, but the story of forgiving those who visited pain upon us. It is in this regard that institutions such as the Gacaca, which told the world that even when we have been wronged, that even when we have been abused, that even when our kith and kin have been slaughtered, we can still embrace those who slaughtered us. So today, we stand here from different generations, from different faiths, from different parts of the world, to remind ourselves that our diversity is to be celebrated, not to be abused. To remind ourselves that we may be of different races, that we may be geographically from different parts of the world, but our humanity and our red blood unites us. So whether you are from Europe, from the Americas, from Africa, from the Caribbean, let us use the occasion of the Kwibuka on the 30th anniversary to remind ourselves that it behooves us as human beings to always do good, because it is good to do good. May God bless and guide us at all times. Be blessed.
Thank you so much, Prof. Today is a moment of reflection. Allow me to introduce our panelists that are here seated with me. And I will allow them to just, first of all, start off with their own overview or their own reflections, 30 years since the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis, and how such a forum can be able to instill a level of accountability, but also trying to understand and reflecting on that. I want to start off with Dr. Fred Goloba Mutewi, who's on my far left. He is a research coordinator and associate analyst at Never Again Rwanda. He's done a lot of research extensively, and he's also from Rwanda. So I want to understand from you, Dr. Fred, Rwanda today, we've seen in publications, we witness the rankings of the country, best place to be born a woman, among the fastest growing economies, cleanest city in Africa. And I'll add that it's a country where you'll keep your phone the longest. I'm a witness. I have a lot of old phones bundled up in a drawer. But there's work that has been done to actually get to this level. I wanted to start off with that reflection and try to tell us what your thought process is on that journey, and then we'll be able to continue on that note.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eugene. And yeah, I would like to thank our audience for turning up to remember 30 years on. My reflection is very simple. Some people usually talk about post-genocide Rwanda as some kind of miracle. What has happened in Rwanda is a miracle. It's not a miracle. What has happened in Rwanda is the outcome of deliberate efforts by the people who lead that country, or who have led that country over the last 30 years to make it what it is. Now, I would like to talk about this whole idea of never again. Some people think that never again is about there not being another genocide in Rwanda. I think it's more than that. Never again is about making sure that the conditions that led to the genocide in Rwanda do not come back again, or are not allowed to emerge. Now, what is it about Rwanda that I personally find profound? What I find profound about Rwanda is what is usually most neglected about that country. And that is how Rwanda has managed, after the genocide, to rebuild so quickly, to remain stable and to remain peaceful. How that How has that happened? Now, I am a political scientist, and I'm very much interested in politics. And one of the things that I keep hearing about Rwanda is how there is no democracy in Rwanda, there is no opposition in Rwanda. And I always ask people, what do you mean when you say these things? Now, for me, the profound thing about Rwanda is the political arrangements that were put in place after the genocide. Because today's Rwanda politically doesn't work like pre-genocide Rwanda. In that when people say Rwanda is not a democracy, I always say, no, Rwanda is a democracy. But Rwanda is not a conventional liberal democracy. Rwanda is a democracy of a different kind. But what's interesting about politics in Rwanda is that after the genocide, the people who took over the country decided to not allow themselves to be carried away by this idea of competitive politics as we know it elsewhere in Africa. That Rwanda has had a government of national unity since the end of the genocide. Rwanda has a consensus-building political system. And it is in that rejection of conventional political contestations, or what we call adversarial contestations, that we find the answer for Rwanda's continued stability and for the government not being deflected from what it should do in terms of rebuilding the country, but being allowed to focus on the important things that happen, or that should happen. If you see clean Kigali, if you see the countryside looking the way it does, if you see that there are very few political controversies in the country, if you see that there is no corruption in the country, or there is very little corruption in the country, it all goes back to what I think is the foundation. The foundation is consensus building. We have 11 political parties in the country. Now, this is not very well known by a lot of people who comment on Rwanda. They think Rwanda is a one-party state, and I read this and I hear it repeated many times. Rwanda is not a one-party state. Rwanda is a multi-party democracy, but not the way we conceive of democracies in Africa. Of the 11 political parties in the country, 9 are in government. Only 2 are not, and the 2 which are not are the smallest political parties. But then we have something called the National Forum of Political Organizations, where the 2 political parties that are not represented in parliament meet with those, that are not represented in the cabinet, meet with those that are in government to talk about the most important things about the country. This is where the most potentially controversial issues are discussed and fleshed out, and then they go to parliament. So Rwanda has a unique political system that has allowed for the stability that we see today. Now, if you look at Rwanda's neighbors, or some of them, with our politics, and I should remind you, or for those who don't know, I'm originally Ugandan. I come from one of the most vibrant democracies. The problem with democracy, the way we conceive of it, is that every time we have elections or democratic elections, what happens is that we fight. We beat each other up, we break each other's limbs, crack each other's skulls, the security forces are deployed. Election campaigns look like war. And I always ask people, what is so good about this? Now, in my opinion, what I see in Rwanda, because in Rwanda we have very short election campaigns, 1 month. No violence, no insults, no fighting. And after that 1 month we have elections, and the following day after the elections you can hardly tell there has been an election in the country. You can hardly tell there has been a campaign. So for me, it's those things about Rwanda that explain everything else that we see, and which I always wish other countries in Africa could look at and possibly emulate if they could. Thanks.
Wonderful. We'll come back to Dr. Fred. Prof, I want to just give you another chance to just probe some of the statements you mentioned earlier on, and also picking from what Dr. Fred says. And I would like us to probe this notion that if there is no confrontational politics, then there is no democracy. I hear a lot of that, and because you've been in and out of Rwanda many times, you've observed the country, what sort of lessons can we learn from that model? We are not saying one size fits all is what we need to do, but what sort of lessons can all of us learn from that sort of a model of democracy?
Thank you very much. Let me pick up the words you've used. There is no one-size-fits-all democracy. I hold the view that each society's system of governance must be informed by her realities. And I want to remind us that when we talk about democracy, even here in Africa, we use foreign tongues. We are speaking in English, therefore we say democracy. Some will be speaking in French. I always ask people in Africa, in your mother tongue, what is the word for democracy? And I'm much more comfortable with the word governance. How do you govern yourselves? And the post-colonial African state finds ourselves sometimes in a very difficult position because you are a multi-nation state. You go to a country and you find different nations which historically had different governance systems. But we have chosen after 1963 to make good of what we have. We have a lemon, we make ourselves lemonade, if you allow me that analogy. So what do? You allow your specific circumstances to define how you are going to govern yourselves and to make sure that the governance system you use is acceptable to the critical majority of the people. Will it be perfect? No. Perfection is a goal that we aim at, never achieve. And I believe that the history of post-genocide Rwanda after 1994 so far is good. And I use the word so far. Let us not imagine that things have been solved for all times. There are forces within and without Rwanda that would want to disturb the calm that is there. And we must be eternally vigilant to ensure that those forces are not given the oxygen to thrive. Being aware of that, it is also important to embrace systems that try to include. And in the case of Rwanda, one of the things that I think can inform governance itself is how Gacaca was used. Look at the tribunal in Rwanda, which was based in Arusha. If we had been following that model, how many people would have been tried? And even if you convicted people, how would you have restored calm in the society? But when the society took the view and went back to the history of Rwanda and said, we have a system. This system says that if you committed a crime and you come out and admit that crime, you who are the perpetrator of the crime, we will rehabilitate you. If we could use that and deploy it in the manner in which we organize our affairs, then I think we can solve many problems. Easier said than done. But I hold the view that it is important to learn those lessons and always to remind us that even when there is good, evil is alive and well, seeking to destroy the good. So our guards must be up and our guards must remain up. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you. Dr. Lonzen, we've had engagements with you on the platform, the summit, and you've also been very active, even as the managing editor for the Pan-African Review magazine and online media platform. You've written extensively about the democracy model in Rwanda. But as you give us your thought process, what's running in your mind, I want us to also reflect back in the journey of building that system 30 years later. Prof. Bielo says, it's not a one-size-fits-all. All of us have different and unique systems. But sometimes, like you said, there are forces that sometimes want to impose, for lack of a better word, a one-size-fits-all standard, especially for democracy. Talk to us a bit what's running on your mind right now, 30 years later.
Thank you, Anangwe. So, if adversarial politics set the context for genocide, it would be irrational to continue adversarial politics in the post-genocide setting. So it only makes sense that the nature of politics would have to shift from what was a key factor in the setting of the genocide. Therefore, actually this was part of the constitutional making process in Rwanda. In the constitutional making process, when during the consultations, when the consultations were taken to the people, and the word was used for political parties, the people did not want this. They said, we don't want political parties, because they understood political parties with adversarial interactions. Because they said, those people are the ones who brought us problems. We killed each other because they told us to kill, and it started with them, those parties. Yeah? So they don't want political parties. So it was taken back, redrafting. The question was set up differently. They said political organizations. They said, okay, the political organizations, they work together. Oh, that is fine. That is okay. It's okay. So the working together to solve problems or find solutions for the country. In the constitutional making process, the people of Rwanda approved that, but they did not want political parties because they, in their mind, these are contentional adversarial entities that are there to incite them to do bad. So now, the interesting part also about post-genocide Rwanda is that those who seek to promote democracy in Rwanda, they identify with adversarial politics because that is the kind of politics they practice in their homes. So they want to export that politics in Rwanda because it's the only form of politics they accept is democracy. Anything that is not like what they practice at home is illegitimate to them. Therefore, anybody that naturally, in their view, makes the Rwandan political system illegitimate because it does not look like theirs, because it is not adversarial like the kind they practice at home. And if the political system is illegitimate, that means they cannot support it. That means anybody who is fighting that political system will be supported. They will support anyone ready to fight that political system that they conceive to be illegitimate. Now, especially naturally speaking, the party that is likely to fight that kind of politics is likely to be the kind of party that seeks to bring back the adversarial politics that cause problems. So those who seek to promote politics, democracy in Rwanda tend to align with forces that seek to bring back the kind of politics that cause problems in the first place. Right. Yes.
While you still have the mic, there's been that notion then, going by what you said and what we've heard from the previous two speakers, that kind of model stifles voices of dissent and also does not allow for new candidates. For example, we are heading to an election and President Paul Kagame has accepted the nomination to be the flag bearer again. And that is causing jitters in some corners. And the argument is, you've overstayed. And I want you to just school us a bit on that notion and what misconception has been there that you'd want to correct today.
Well, again, freedom of speech must be in context. In this case, if you're talking about politics and political parties, the objective of politics must be constructive, just like the people in the constitution making process articulated. So if freedom is destructive, then there's nowhere in the world in which that kind of freedom is acceptable. Therefore, if you're talking about freedom of speech, to what objective is that freedom of speech? Is it to incite people to do genocide? Is it to introduce the kind of politics that brings back confrontation in a kind of society that is recovering from this kind of tragedy, in whose memories are still fresh about the causes of the experience they suffered? So the definition of speech must be relevant to the experiences that people face or went through.
Right, all right. I'll come back to probe that even more. I want to hear from a lady who I want us to applaud because she made it officially a panel and not a manel. When I say manel, is all men, but she officially makes this a panel. Let's appreciate Charity Kagwi Ndongo for giving us officially a panel. Thank you, Charity. Charity, you are the current head of anti-corruption, crime prevention and criminal justice program at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime Regional Office for Eastern Africa here in Nairobi, but you are also a prosecutor for the ICTR. And in the opening remarks and also in his introductory remarks on this panel, Prof has hailed Gachacha. And ICTR does not, or there are no good words, for lack of a better word, in terms of the work that it did, in terms of bringing justice to the victims and survivors of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis. I'll give you a chance to talk to us today. What has been the contribution of ICTR in the Rwanda we see today, 30 years later?
Thank you. And may I first say that ICTR was formed to basically hold those who are most responsible for the genocide. That meant the top cadre. That's why we had the Prime Minister who was tried, all the leaders who are like was seen as really leading during that time. What I do think that could have been done better was there should have been a much more consultative process when the world community, the international community stood up and recognized this is a genocide. A genocide requires a global response. It is the worst crime that can be done, and it requires a global response. However, at the table, Rwanda was not at the table to discuss, for example, how long, when would the crimes, the period of culpability, which they decided was 1994 alone. There should have been a lot more consultation with the country itself. I know it was difficult at that time. We can all remember post-genocide Rwanda, as Paul Kagame said, was he to decide to try everybody, put them in jails, he'd have to have a country of jails. And it was not feasible. But I think what the ICTR decided was to remove the whole top leadership, all the top politicians, all the top military leaders, everybody who was seen as the top. In ICTR, we had the whole top leadership of the military, the cabinet, of course, the richest man was also on the list of the people who needed to be held culpable. What I think is that it showed to the region that nobody is untouchable. And I'll tell you that because before, when we see rich people, important people, I remember one of them visiting ICTR when I was there, one of the people that in Kenya people were very afraid of. And he could see that there's a possibility that even him, he could go behind there.
There's a young generation in this room and they might not know who you're talking about.
I don't think I want to mention his name because he's a Kenyan. And perhaps it's not nice to mention his name right now.
Oh.
But they did realize that they too could be held accountable. Before it was winner takes all, and if you had the propaganda behind the genocide, they were saying, if we win, the world community will forget. That was what they were going at. And if they won, nobody would have questioned them. However, that winner take all is no longer viable. The world community stood up when there was a genocide against the Jews, and that's when the Genocide Convention came up. The world community could have done better for Rwanda, because at that point, I must say that they were so blind that Habyarimana's regime was still a darling of the donors. The French actually sent help to him during the war. There was a lot of help and sympathy going towards Habyarimana's regime, not understanding what was happening on the ground.
Yeah.
And then you see the response. By the time they wanted to say the word genocide, they were at the Security Council, and they refused to use the word genocide because it would require a global response.
Yeah. But it's been 30 years. What lessons, what are the untold stories you can whisper to us today? And just tell us that these are the things that stopped us, and today we've learned X, Y, Z. Because Prof said conventions and treaties are not enough. And here you say there was that convention that was born, but we still continue to see these atrocities. When we say never again genocide, do we really mean it? What's the missing link that would make us walk the talk?
I think what Prof said is people quickly forget history. History is all those 1 million lives that were lost in such a horrible fashion, the blood that was shed. In fact, I remember people were saying all the demons have left hell and they've gone to Rwanda. People forget the pain, the type of genocide this was, with crude instruments, and in such a fast fashion. People forget. And I think that's the saddest thing, because we should not forget. The blood was not shed in vain. If one of the books that we used to read at that time was part of the genocide story, was they wanted to kill everybody so that nobody could tell the story. Yeah, and that the story would be forgotten. We have to make a commitment that we won't forget the pain, the anguish of being raped,
yeah.
Being, watching people being decapitated, someone's mother, someone's father, someone's sister, someone's wife, children. And we forget, and I think that's the problem, or we think it would not happen to us. And that was my problem. Coming from Kenya, I thought, no, in Rwanda, there could be a genocide because there are two tribes, so one tribe can turn against the other. But in Kenya, we are 42 or 43. How is it possible to have a genocide in this country?
Yeah.
And then we saw the signs. Then we saw the signs it can happen anywhere.
Yeah.
And what was so terrifying was that you didn't think you could be a victim or one of the victim groups. And it suddenly looks, the story could happen at any time, at any place. Humanity is able to go down that path again, unless we always remember.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Dr. Fred, I'd like to read your thoughts, picking up from the aspect of access to justice. And I want us to talk a bit about international justice and its role, because up to today, despite all the signs of growth, transformation, even within the justice system of Rwanda, there are still countries that continue to harbor these genocides. And some of them are arrested in those countries, but they refuse to repatriate them back to Rwanda to face justice. What's the claim? They will not access fair trial. I mean, it seems Rwanda needs to validate itself to show that we can do it. Read or tell us what you feel, especially on that aspect of access to justice. 30 years later, we have victims, we have survivors who are still yearning for justice. We've talked about Kabuga, who could probably be released because of the claims that he can't stand trial. I want to read your thoughts. When you listen to survivors, what are you hearing from them on this aspect of international justice?
Thank you very much. I'm not going to restrict myself to just survivors. It's quite clear that in Rwanda there is a fairly significant degree of dissatisfaction with so-called international justice. Now, I'm not sure in what sense we should be referring to whatever we are talking about as international justice. Because what has happened in terms of how the world views Rwanda or Rwanda's institutions has to do with how Rwanda is reported about in media. International media seem to have a knack for, and I'm not sure if this is deliberate, but I think that they do have this idea that they know everything, and they project what they know onto the world, and it's usually what they know that we also get to know and believe to be true. The refusal by some jurisdictions to return genocide perpetrators to Rwanda has to do with this idea that somehow the judiciary in Rwanda is not independent. Now, those of us who live in the country know that this is not true. But also we know that there are jurisdictions that have gone beyond this idea and actually returned genocide or alleged genocide perpetrators to Rwanda. Canada has done it, the United States has done it. The Scandinavian countries have been much more willing than others to return these people to Rwanda. And as far as we know, the evidence that we see is that when they have been committed to trial, these trials have satisfied what people may refer to as international standards. So I think that alongside the general dissatisfaction with international justice is this ever-present idea inside Rwanda that Rwanda is misrepresented in many ways. Now I can give you one of the most annoying but current examples is this argument about whether Britain should send are they refugees? Asylum seekers to Rwanda for processing before a decision is made about what should happen to them. Now, those who are opposing this in Britain keep saying, oh, you know, Rwanda is not a democracy and these people's rights are not going to be respected and so on and so forth. But actually what people do not seem to take into account is that Britain suggested this to Rwanda after Rwanda had actually been doing this for years by itself. When President Kagame became the chairman of the AU, he decided that African refugees who were being mistreated in Libya, who were being sold as slaves and so on and so forth, could be relocated from Libya and taken to other places where they would find safety. Now, he proposed this as something that could be taken up by different countries, but no country stepped up to do it. Now, Rwanda started evacuating African refugees from Libya. There were Ethiopians, Eritreans, Sudanese, different nationalities, and bringing them to Rwanda, housing them, feeding them, and keeping them in Rwanda pending their processing for relocation to third countries. Now, this wasn't funded by any foreign government, although the UNHCR was helping. A lot of these people that came to Rwanda under this program left Rwanda, went to Canada, went to various places, others went to Uganda, but no one has actually accused Rwanda of having violated their rights. It's only until Britain saw what Rwanda was doing successfully on its own and suggested they could also actually handle their asylum seekers from Rwanda. And now this whole thing of, you know, these people, Rwanda is not safe for refugees, Rwanda is not safe for asylum seekers, and so on and so forth. That's one example. In Rwanda, we have a school of girls from Afghanistan. An entire school was relocated from Afghanistan and brought to Rwanda. Now, these young girls from Afghanistan and all their teachers have been living in Rwanda for years. God knows whether they will go back to Afghanistan or move on to another country, but they're living in Rwanda and they're safe. But every time I look at British media, the people in Britain who the government suggests should be brought to Rwanda are now being seen as hapless victims. These are going to be victims of suppression and blah, 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 blah. We have a full medical school from Sudan, which has been relocated to Rwanda. Dozens of Sudanese young medical students are now living and studying in Rwanda. The whole school was evacuated to Rwanda. No one is telling us that these people are being suppressed or oppressed or their rights are being violated. So it's this continuous misreporting by these pompous Western journalists who are ignorant of what happens in the country that now informs international public opinion about Rwanda. But the facts are there and anyone can see them. Now, let me just go back to a little bit to the question you raised to Lonzen about there being no room for dissent in Rwanda. I mentioned the National Forum of Political Organizations. Now, as I said before, post-genocide Rwanda is very nervous about recreating the conditions that led to the genocide. And one of the conditions was this endless dissenting in the streets, people fighting in the streets, parties fighting, transferring these conflicts into the communities. So post-genocide Rwanda is very nervous about recreating those conditions. This is the basis for the creation of the National Forum of Political Organizations, so that political organizations that are not in parliament can meet with their counterparts in the forum and deal with those matters that could otherwise create the kind of dissent that exporters of conventional multi-party politics want to see in each and every country. So the National Forum of Political Organizations is a space for political parties to dissent and to argue among themselves. And just to go a little bit into the details, in the National Forum of Political Organizations, however large a party is, however small it is, each party is represented by 4 people. Decision making in this forum is by absolute consensus.
Yeah, but let me probe you on that just a second.
Yeah.
And it is that actually creates that notion.
Now, perhaps if you could just allow me to finish my point.
Okay, fair enough.
Where one could say there is no space for dissent, there's actually a lot of space for discussion. And I am now involved in trying to draw up the sector strategic plan for the Ministry of Local Government. And one of the conversations we're having is whether there's just simply too many forums in Rwanda where people are supposed to participate in decision making. Because in my opinion, there's simply too many. And what we see now is participation fatigue. So forums have been created across the country. In communities, we have communal work. People go to do communal work every last Saturday of the month, and they discuss their own issues within their own communities. There are forums for parents, there are forums for women, there are forums for youth. The entire country is teeming with forums for discussion. And some of us are beginning to think, this is simply too much. You're putting too many demands on ordinary people to discuss things that they would rather not be discussing. So where there is no room for dissent, there is room for discussion. You must know about the National Dialogue Council.
Yes.
Well, this is a meeting that happens every year in Rwanda, bringing together all the leaders in the country in their different categories. Now, you will have a few hundred people sitting in a room in Kigali. This meeting is being broadcast live on radio. It is broadcast live on TV. It is being streamed on the internet. So Rwandans inside the country and Rwandans outside the country can actually participate in this meeting. Rwandans in Kigali, Rwandans outside Kigali can participate in this meeting. The president is there, ministers are there, governors are there, security chiefs are there. Rwandans can phone in and complain about all kinds of things. Now, when somebody says there's no room for dissent in Rwanda, do they know that there is such a thing as a National Dialogue Council? Do they know about the National Forum of Political Organizations? Do they know about all these different forums across the entire country where people are now saying, guys, we are tired of taking part in these endless discussions?
Right.
Thanks.
Prof, the question of narrative creation, and going by what Dr. Fred says, it seems from his own words that international media seems to have taken over in shaping that narrative, and it seems that is what now is believed out here. I want to ask you a question on your own assessment, because we have media on the continent, the African media in telling the African story. All these are beautiful things happening in Rwanda. And I want to hear your thoughts on either a failure or a lack of interest. What would you prescribe to the Pan-African media, quote unquote?
See, let me preface my response by saying that in Africa, we have now turned the art of complaining into a science, and we must stop that. We must tell our story and invest in telling that story. We don't. So that we as it were, wedded to what we call international media, to BBC, France, Al Jazeera, and all these. And we can keep on complaining until the cows come home, and they will not. So the time is now for us to have media that tells our story, because that is what we want the world to know about us. Are we investing in that? We are not. And sometimes we don't have the budget to support that. But if we look at some of these things regionally, for example, within the context of East African community and within the context of the African Union, and we are able to tell our stories, even to articulate our understanding of governance as being specific to our circumstances, then people will begin to consume that story.
Yeah.
We don't. So I think the time has come that we must stop agonizing and begin organizing. We must not have media which is involved, which thinks that news is importing domestic squabbles and little disagreements amongst politicians. We must stop that and begin to engage in a proper manner. I watch news about Africa in different media, and you can see that people invest in this thing. You have somebody, whether you like them or not, in Al Jazeera. He's actually based in Kigali. But take any typical African media. They'll be in Nairobi and reporting about an event in Rabat, Morocco. They don't know what is happening. They're just listening to other media, and then they pick it up and present it as their own. I think, in conclusion, the time is now. Tell our story. Tell it in a manner that is believable. Let us have the story backed with verifiable evidence. And in the fullness of time, people will begin to understand and embrace our story because it is evidence-based and verifiable.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Dr. Lonzen, you're in the media space, the Pan-African Review publication. Guilty as charged?
We are trying to start to steer the ship in the different direction. So I want to return to a couple of points. You asked me a question, why Kagame keeps running. I'll return to it. The post-genocide Rwanda is constructed in such a way that it addresses what it identifies as a problem. What was the cause and what its solution? So you see a opposite. You can turn it around and see that this solution addresses this problem. So when you look at the question of dissent that you asked me about, the post-genocide politics aims to serve unity. The purpose of politics is to serve unity, the unity of Rwandans. So any kind of politics that does not do that is illegal. And that what problem does that address? It addresses the fact that pre-genocide politics was divisive. The division of Rwandans, it was embedded. It was founded on the division of Rwandans, which was inherited from the colonial regime. The post-genocide, the post-colonial governments inherited the rhetoric or the ideology that divides Rwandans, and obviously it set the context for genocide. Yeah. So the post-genocide politics came to address that question of division, and therefore said the objective of politics in post-genocide Rwanda will be to serve the unity of Rwandans. So it addresses a problem.
Yeah.
So
can I interject?
One second.
Okay.
I just want to be clear that any politics that is outside that objective is illegal by constitution. Now, the second point I want to raise on this matter is, Golowa said that these people who killed, they ran away and they're in the Western capitals and they are not facing justice. And those countries are not sending them to Rwanda because they claim Rwanda's justice is impartial. They won't get a fair hearing. Fair enough. But they are required to prosecute them where they are. If their justice is so fair and so good, why don't they prosecute them there? So it means that if they are refusing to send them to Rwanda and refusing to prosecute them where they are, it means that they are facilitating the evasion of justice. So they are complicit in the crimes of these people. Now, even worse, these people who are evading justice in that manner, they rebrand themselves as political opponents of Rwanda. And because their politics serves the objective where these who seek to promote politics in Rwanda consider the politics inside Rwanda illegitimate because it does not look like their own, are able to align with these rebranded killers who now call themselves politicians, who seek to bring back in Rwanda adversarial politics. Therefore, they become partners. That alliance of killers and the Western authorities exists. So the third point, the last point I want to make on the question is why Kagame keeps running. I don't want to speak for him, but I think I have an idea of why he keeps running. The post-genocide politics in Rwanda set the standard for leadership so high that you see the nature of the challenges and the threat that exist, they naturally set the standard for leadership so high. Now, it's not a matter of simply replacing Kagame. If it was a matter of replacing him, he would have been replaced so long ago. So it's a matter of meeting the standards that have been set. So,
and the argument is what is being done to allow others to meet those standards.
And the question is who should be doing that?
Who should be? You tell me.
Yeah, so Kagame or the RPF does not exist as a political party to nurture their replacement. That's not how politics works. It should not go in the opposition to raise leaders to the standards that meet the expectations of Rwandans.
Show us your successor, mold your successor, prepare your successor.
Yeah. So I believe, of course, no one believes that Kagame is immortal, that he'll be there forever. But at the same time, once you address the challenge of Kagame's immortality on the one hand, you also address the challenge of the standards. And as long as Kagame remains alive and capable and willing to serve, in the view of those who see that the objective is the standard, not the replacement, he will continue to run. Or when someone within the RPF, because the RPF is not there to groom opposition, someone within the RPF meets the standards set, or they may not be, maybe to the standard Kagame has set, but at a standard that is acceptable given the circumstances and challenges Rwanda faces. Therefore, as long as the objective will not be to merely replace Kagame, and as long as a replacement of Kagame within the party who meets a certain threshold of the standard has not emerged, Kagame will continue to run. And it would be irresponsible of him to not continue running if they have not been able to meet the threshold of the standard required to lead post-genocide Rwanda.
Right. Dr. Fred, you want to intervene, but then I'll come back to Charity. And as you intervene, please let me add a caveat or a question to the same, especially on the aspect of succession politics. All these great strides that we've seen 30 years post the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis, let's talk to the notion of when you overstay, you spoil what you have built. Talk to us a bit about that notion. How do you see it? Do you agree with it? Do you not agree with it?
Well, I would like to dodge your specific question and say something about my understanding of the broad context within which what we see in Rwanda is happening in terms of leadership continuity. In 2000, between 2013 and 2017, when the country was discussing whether President Kagame should stay on after the expiry of his second term, there was a lot of discussion across the country. And I, having done research in Rwanda for as long as I have done and having the kind of access that I've developed over time, I spent a great deal of time speaking to prominent Rwandans about this, both members of the RPF, but also members of the other political parties. I think the obsession with whether Kagame should step down or not sidesteps an important question. Do Rwandans want him to step down? If they do, which Rwandans? Do Rwandans want him to continue? If they do, which Rwandans? Now, we all know that there is no country where decisions of this kind are made outside of the broad political elite. Now, as I said, there are 11 political parties in the country. What was the view of these parties when this question came up? From my own understanding and from my interaction with various party leaders, the view was that he's the best choice we have for now. And therefore we, as Rwandans, we will make the decision as to whether he stays or not. Now, outsiders can criticize us, but this is our country, so we decide. And I addressed this matter with various political leaders, and they were telling me the same thing. Earlier, before that, I had been speaking to some people who were adamant that he would retire. He wasn't the kind of person who would stay on after 2 terms. By 2014, they had changed their minds for all kinds of reasons that I'm not going to go into. Now, again, we see him standing, or we see he's poised to stand in the next few weeks. Now, something happened last week that struck me, and many people may have missed it. That immediately he accepted to stand again. The second largest party, the Social Democratic Party, immediately declared their support for him, and they said they are not going to present a candidate. Now, this is the second largest party. The RPF, President Kagame's party, the RPF, is the largest party. The second largest party declared almost immediately that they will not be sponsoring a candidate. They are going to support President Kagame's candidacy. The third largest political party, the Liberal Party, did the same. Now, but also the RPF is in official coalition with 5 other parties. So there is a 6-party coalition that supports the RPF. Now, those 6, including the RPF plus the Social Democratic Party and the Liberal Party, you now have 8 out of 11 parties having declared they are supporting his candidacy.
Right.
Now, I assume that these parties reflect the opinions of their members, in which case one can argue that the vast majority of Rwandans support the idea that he should continue. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? My response is always, it's up to Rwandans. It's their country. It's their decision.
Right. Allow me to invite Charity, then I'll come back to Prof, and then we'll open the floor for questions. If you have any questions, feel free to prepare yourself, and we'll be able to bring you a mic to be able to ask a question. Charity, last time we spoke, there was this conversation around whether there's a thin line or the line is very clear between hate speech and freedom of press. You did participate in all the media hearings, and we know the role the media played in the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis. And I want to hear your thoughts in terms of the building blocks that since 30 years later that have been put in place to ensure that there's a clear line, clear understanding that, hey, this is hate speech. It is not freedom of expression. We know of a leader within the region who actually outrightly declared war on a fellow country. Are there any jurisprudence or any guiding legal processes that clearly indicate this is hate speech and it has these consequences, because we know the role that media can play in that sense?
Thank you very much. And before I go into that, I just want to, maybe in response to the role of the international community, just say that while ICTR could have been better when it comes to the spending of money, it was important that the world community comes together and recognizes the genocide. It was important that jurisprudence comes around these issues, around the international jurisprudence, around the genocide, and especially that of the Tutsis. And things are put in place. For example, like you were saying, when does hate speech go into persecution? Because the accused were found guilty of persecution as a crime against humanity, direct and public incitement to genocide. So when does this become a responsibility of the fourth estate? And now it's not just the fourth estate as we know them, the Al Jazeera, the big ones that people watch, but we know right now most of our young people are listening to TikTok, they're on social media, and what is the responsibility of the person behind the keyboard? There's Twitter, you know, where they actually say that they can actually mob justice you on social media.
They did that to the president of Kenya, kicked him out of Twitter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when is there responsibility and individual responsibility for what you say? And this comes from a level where it's at the bottom level where even the person behind the keyboard just decides to either, and we've seen this even in schools, bully children into committing suicide, you know, things like that. But coming back to this, when people have the microphone like I do, they have a responsibility that you have to your neighbor. No right is completely, no right does not have duties. A right has to have a duty. Your right to speak also starts where your duty to me for safety. So when you start talking, for example, against a certain ethnic group, and I'll tell you, for example, people might not know, I see very many young people, but right from 1990, was it around the early 90s, the magazine, which was a little tabloid magazine called Kangura, not a big magazine or big newspaper like Nation or Standard, it was a small tabloid, but it was widely read. I would actually say today it would be like TikTok, people reading on TikTok, people watching on, sending messages to each other on WhatsApp. But it called itself the Kangura, which meant awake, and it was supposed to awaken the Hutu conscience. And then it started targeting. And I think for me it was a big deal because the first target was the Tutsi women. They were said, whether the Tutsi woman is your wife or your mother, you have to be very careful, or your concubine or your employee, be careful because she's working with her brothers outside. She's never loyal. They talked about people with businesses. Don't join this particular, these people are never trustworthy. Guys, if you listen to some of these lines, you can't trust these people with business. They will always cheat you. So you must, as a Hutu, not have business dealings with Tutsi. So slowly they start isolating the group. Everybody wonders, how could one day people, your neighbor, ordinary people, wake up and kill people just like that? How is it possible? In fact, most of the Rwandese, I know, they said nobody thought it was possible. UNAMIR was right there, and they just put away, it's just talk. Nobody thought it was possible. that a genocide could happen by ordinary young people with machetes, not by, people see gangs and other things, quite organized gangs, but these were just your neighbors picking up a machete and killing you or throwing you in a grave alive and you die, or you run to a church, and before churches were places of refuge, suddenly it was no longer a place of refuge. How do you reach a point when you think it is okay to kill somebody else, and there has to be propaganda around that? There has to be something that you do not feel you're killing a fellow human being. You're killing a snake, which is what they called the Tutsis. And we hear that even amongst ourselves, where you say some of these people are like snakes, these people are like this. Anyway, you're killing a snake. They call them inyenzi. What should you do with an inyenzi? It's a Bantu language, so inyenzi is like a cockroach, isn't it? What do you do with an inyenzi? What are you supposed to do? Exterminate it. And for days on end, young men were running on the streets singing, "We shall exterminate them." Yeah, we shall exterminate the inyenzi. But people were sitting back saying, it's not possible. And when we were young, we had a term that people would say, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me."
Yeah.
It never happens like that. Words are so powerful. The difference between this particular genocide, and I must say beforehand, even the Tutsis, there used to be killings of Tutsis from 1959. Why was this so effective?
Yeah.
The power of the pen. The pen is mightier than the sword. And in this place I say the pen, because it was a newspaper. The word that you use is mightier than a sword.
Yeah.
And this is what led to this kind of inhumane, one person actually told me he wanted to kill his own mother. She was a Tutsi woman. He decided to kill her. So he's one person who turned out to be, to give evidence for the prosecution, took a plea deal. And he said he decided to do that because he felt he would kill her more humanely than other people. So it's better that he kills his own mother.
Wow.
So you would find that, somebody who is your best friend suddenly turns and you're like, what is this that is actually happening? Don't we know each other? Haven't I done this for you? But then again, so there's the propaganda machine in which this person is no longer a human being. Their pain, their tears do not touch you. In fact, I remember people would say, I'd rather plead guilty to murder than rape. So I ask, why wouldn't you plead guilty to rape? He says, no, I have children. So murdering was easier than pleading to rape. And you look at it and you say, yes, they reached a point where people closed their eyes to the propaganda machine, which was the radio. And we all listen to the radio, and especially the vernacular radio. All of us know the power of the vernacular radio.
Right.
Especially during election time, everybody's speaking in their own vernacular. And we all have an oral tradition. And Rwanda is also a very oral community. So they would talk in proverbs. Yeah, quite a lot of proverbs. We've had them about different tribes around us. But one of the proverbs I remember was that a Tutsi is so jealous that if you heal him, if he's sick and then you heal him, of his eyes blind, he'll wake up and the first thing he'll do is look at you with jealousy, wanting to take your things. So it was this thing that this person is not a person. And they're just, they're something that we should get rid of. And you have to get the whole population to believe it. So when you see this happening, and it begins slowly, it's time to wake up. Yeah. It is never okay to dehumanize somebody else. It is never okay. And that's why I say it's not a thin line. It is a line that is drawn in the sand, that this person is a human being, deserves to be respected, deserves to be treated with respect and with humanity.
Perfect. Any questions in the room? I would like to request for assistance to get a microphone here, or if we have mics on the floor, please say your name. If you have a question to any of the panelists, please specify. There are hands here on this row. All right. Over here. Keep your hand up, please. They're coming from behind. Keep your hand up. So please give him also. All right, go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Exel Tagambo. I'm the Dean at the Institute of Peace Studies and International Relations at the Kenyatta University College here in Nairobi. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for your inputs. It's very enlightening. I have two questions. One goes to Professor Mumba, and I want to take it away from politics to get back to the memory. You mentioned the silence that we experienced back in 1994, and what Madam has just described seems very familiar with what is happening in Eastern Congo. We see people are singled out who are reduced to stateless, and we see even people eating them like choma. What does it take for our regional governments at least to recognize that these people are denied their citizenship rather than categorizing them as terrorists? That's number one. Number two goes to Dr. Mutebi. The genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda raised a deeper question. It's a question about the post-colonial nation state in Africa. Because this nation state has become like a continuation of the colonial state with all its characteristics. A state that is remote controlled, a client state, a state that is alien to its own people, a state that doesn't report to the people, but report to the former masters. Which is why we see in West Africa, for example, people are questioning this state and talking about refoundation. In some of the mechanisms you talked about that question the current perception of democracy are going back to our way of parava, our way of what you call discussions, communal discussions that lead to good decision-making position. So in your view, because this goes beyond Rwanda, it goes beyond Kenya, it is really an issue of concern in most of African countries. Do we reform the nation state, or do we revolutionize the nation state? Thank you.
Thank you. Prof, you want to take it?
Thank you very much. I know the attention spans are now tested, so I'll be very brief. One, the post-colonial African state is very fragile. We must never forget that. It's fragile because if you look at any typical post-colonial African state, as I said a little earlier, you have nationalities, nations divided. So if you look at the situation, for example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, you'll find one ethnic group on either side of the border. Whether it is in Rwanda, whether it is with Burundi, whether it is with Central African Republic, whether it is with Angola, whether it is with Zambia. So alive to those realities, what must be done? In my view, we must rethink governance. If we don't rethink governance, then we are not going to resolve the issues. And I think as early as 1940s, an African-American, John Henry Clark, said that all African countries, when they regained their independence, they inherited systems of government, and they tried to mimic those systems of governance, and he said, none of them will ever succeed on the basis of such mimicry. So what must be done? What must be done is that countries must deliberately make efforts. If it is the Democratic Republic of Congo, I believe an all-Congolese Congress to rethink constitutions and how we are going to govern ourselves. How are we going to accommodate traditional governance systems? How are we going to define governance? if it is Rwanda, if it is Burundi, it is not a comfortable conversation, because there are people who are also invested within the current power structures. The political elite who are indigents of those countries thrive, they have become multi-billionaires, they have power, and they love these systems of governance. But the reality is, if you look at many African countries, the message that is emerging now, if we don't rethink governance, then many of these countries are going to collapse. And I need not mention countries, but you can see, look at what is happening in Sudan today. Within less than 1 year, potentially you can create 4 different countries. How are you going to resolve it if you don't have a conversation? It is not going to be easy, but it is a conversation that we must have. If we don't have it, we are merely postponing the problem. And it's not unique to Africa. Look at Europe, what was used to be the Soviet Union. They had to grapple with that issue. Look at India after independence. They had to grapple with that issue. The emergence of Pakistan, the emergence of Bangladesh. Look at Latin America. So these are issues that we don't want to discuss, but I'm telling you, we've got to discuss them. And as I've said, as I conclude, cast your eyes over the map of Africa, and I conclude by cast your eyes on Somalia, cast your eyes on Ethiopia, cast your eyes on Sudan, cast your eyes on Cameroon, cast your eyes on the Democratic Republic of Congo, cast your eyes on Nigeria, and answer that question for yourselves. If we don't resolve it now, future generations will have to resolve it, either by force or through negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Go ahead. Dr. Fred?
Yeah, in response to the question whether we should reform the nation state or revolutionize it, I mean, my answer would be simply to reorder state-society relations. I don't know whether that's what you would call revolutionizing. What I mean by this is that in many of our countries, we ordinary citizens have very little say in what goes on around us. And we've been seduced by this idea that once you have elected your leaders, whether the president or members of parliament or local leaders, that's enough. They are going to now represent you. They are going to work in your interest. I think this is only a theoretical idea, but in practice life doesn't work like that. When I was describing the various forums that I see in Rwanda where people are constantly discussing things to do with their communities, with the country, that's what I call reordering state-society relations. How do you bring ordinary people into actively participating and thinking about what they want to happen to them, what they want from the government? And I think this is what Professor Lumumba calls rethinking governance. Incidentally, last week I had a very long argument with a friend of mine from Germany in Kampala. And again, we were arguing about Rwanda. And her contention was that why does the government of Rwanda want to involve people in all these things that they are doing? Why do they force people to participate in communal work, for instance? Why do they force them to do these other things? And I was saying, well, if they didn't create spaces for them to participate, you would be complaining about them being excluded. Now that a space has been created for them to participate, you're complaining about them being forced to do things. Now, well, as I keep saying in Rwanda that maybe we have too many forums for participation, but what I see in Rwanda has been a reordering of relations between those who are the government and the people it leads. Which reminds me of a conversation I had with the then Minister of Local Government 20 years ago, again about decentralization and community participation. And he said, you know, when we were beginning to decentralize power, we had problems with communities because they did not think that it is their place to tell leaders what to do. And they were responding to us when we said we want to create these community forums, and they said, but you don't know what you're doing. You're creating a situation where people are going to rebel against the government. Is this what you want? But they were acting within the mindset of the pre-genocide period, where the state was very authoritarian and ordinary people were not expected to say things back to people who lead them. But now, again, unknown to so many commentators on Rwandan affairs, actually there's so much space for the ordinary citizen to dissent or to talk back to their leader or to say this is what we want, not what you're suggesting to us. And that's what I call reordering state-society relations. I don't think that we can reinvent the nation state. It has been put in place. For many years, that's how things work, and I'm not sure we can re-engineer that, but we can re-engineer relations between the state and the citizen.
Right.
Thanks.
It's the shortest 1 hour. I'm told we are running out of time, and I want to promise all of us they are available. You can bump onto them during the networking session, and you can ask directly a quick question. So I'll start with you, Dr. Fred, in under half a minute. Just in closing, we have young people in this room, and I want to hear your thoughts or your message to them, because the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis was stopped by the then young people in that state, President Kagame and his peers. I hear a lot of young people who probably sometimes would say, if they were born in 1994, today they are 30 years. And they did not witness firsthand. So sometimes some of them, that memory is sort of faded. How do we ensure that young people continue this memory and these conversations of national unity and maintain the strides that we've seen? I think that's a question I'll ask all of you. And what do you see in the next 30 years for Rwanda in your closing remarks? Starting with you, Dr. Fred.
Thank you very much. I think what we are doing here is part of what we should be doing. And as I said, I'm going back to Rwanda tonight. This entire week is going to be dedicated to conversations within communities at the national level. These things happen all the time. But again, guess what? There are people who say, we've had enough of these commemorations. And sometimes it's actually not Rwandans. It's again outsiders looking into Rwanda and saying, yeah, when is this going to stop? But in my opinion, conversations like the one we are having here, these conversations are happening in Rwanda. They're happening all over the world where Rwanda has embassies. At some point, I'm going to travel to another country where I've been invited again to engage in this kind of conversation. I think we shouldn't stop. We should continue. And as people from Kenya have been saying, other countries can pick up from this and make sure that we don't create conditions that lead our countries to disaster of the kind that we saw in 1994 in Rwanda. Thanks.
Thank you, Prof.
The message we must learn is one, that if we stop conversations such as these, then we create a fertile ground for conflict. We must continue in conversation. Those who are in positions of decision making, we must continue to teach this, because it is by reminding ourselves of the dangers that we face that we avoid the landmines in our paths. And I think it is critical that we have these conversations going forward. Let it be taught in schools, and let us borrow from the wisdom of old that we must never forget, but we must be quick to forgive. If we do that, then we know that what has happened before can happen. That is why eternal vigilance is critical. 30 years in the life of any nation is a very short time. And let us never, ever imagine that it cannot happen again. If we have that in our mind, we'll do everything possible to avoid. That is how I understand never again.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. The path to genocide is 1, adversarial politics, 2, ethnic competition, which leads to ethnic mobilization, 3, whether there's a history of genocide ideology in your society, 4, incitement to genocide. 5, genocide. The extent to which you can control that path is only limited. Once it is outside of ethnic competition, it has left your control, and the ability to prevent genocide is almost impossible. Therefore, when you look at your society, because genocide can happen anywhere, you ask yourself, is there adversarial politics? Is there ethnic mobilization? Is there a history of genocide ideology? So when you look at Rwanda, the history of genocide ideology is what prevents, or that is the reason ethnic-based competition is unacceptable, because once you accept it, you no longer can control the recurrence of genocide. Finally, tragedy forces people to do the right thing. Rwanda did not need tragedy or the genocide to have a politics of cooperation where parties work together, power sharing. It did not need genocide to create an impersonal state where the state distributes opportunities, privileges, public services to everyone regardless of their ethnicity or their origin. It did not need genocide to remove ethnic-based identity card, to have a national identity. It did not need genocide to create a high standard of leadership, a leadership that solves problems, not only in Rwanda, but can also offer solutions outside the continent, peacekeeping, immigration in the UK, and so on. It did not need genocide to create a collective identity where compatriots see in each other a shared future, a sense of camaraderie, a sense that we are in it together. It did not need genocide to create a consciousness of unity, of shared destiny. It did not need genocide to inculcate in the society a sense of dignity, a sense of self-worth as a basis for national and individual aspirations. It did not need dignity it did not need genocide to try to create a sense of that we are not destined to be victims, that we are agents of change, that we can create a new society, that we can create a new consciousness around this belief that we're able, that we can build our aspirations, and that with each other we can protect these aspirations. So the question is what? The role of leadership. The role of leadership determines whether tragedy happens and whether tragedy recurs. Thank you.
Charity, you have the last word.
To all these wise words, it's hard for me to add a lot, but I want perhaps to just say what Professor Lumumba has said. It's really important that we stop being the people whose stories are told by others, that we tell our own story. We tell our own history. If you check, when we were young, we used to be taught about the first man who saw Lake Victoria. I think he was Speke and Grant. That's what we were being told in school. That is clearly not stories that belong to us. Our own story should be told by us. And I'm happy to see, like, in my daughter's school, the genocide is part of their curriculum. They are taught about what happened during the genocide. I believe it should be what we change our curriculum to tell the African stories from an African perspective. And then we will stop being the perpetual victim, the perpetual person always asking for help. Well, we have the richest continent that there is. Secondly, I'd like to talk about the role of the youth. And as I look at the young people, and one of the things that came out when I was, I remember when we were in court, there was a witness who had turned to give evidence against another person, as in a plea deal. And he said, if we don't meet, our children will meet. And that was a threat that the war will be continued by our children. So what does this generation want to hand over to the next generation? Is it a legacy of war? And the war is there. May I use the words that are in the Bible? When Cain killed Abel, the blood is crying out for justice. And let's remember, let's always remember that blood that was shed so that it calls us to justice. Let's remember the possibility of going down that path. The next thing I would like to say, especially in my current role, I think building strong institutions is so important. That you have a strong judiciary, you have an independent prosecution, you have other avenues where the citizens actually say, we can trust. And I want to applaud, first of all, I'd like to applaud Rwanda. Building a community post-genocide is the most impossible task ever. It requires so much commitment. I believe that's what happened to Germany post-genocide. Building that community back also needed a very strong leader, strong leadership. And so I commend them for the strong leadership that they've had in bringing back an almost impossible state into one of the stars of Africa. But to continue that, we do need to have the independent institutions stronger. And I'd like to maybe say, like, for example, in Kenya, when there was an issue around who is the president, who is not the president, instead of a call to arms, people turned to the Supreme Court, and they believed those 7 judges were going to tell them, they give the right decision. And instead of going to war, people stood around the Supreme Court, and they were told, and they agreed. They went back to the Supreme Court, the decision was made, whether you like it or not, there's gonna be a winner or a loser, that's life, move on. And the Kenyans agreed to move on. I also want to talk about Tanzania and just commend Tanzania for the way they've brought their community together. Tanzania does not have as bad politics as I see in other countries. And during the 2007, I was in Tanzania. And one thing that Tanzania did for Kenya, that's the local Tanzania. I had them calling for prayers, and they said, I'll say it in Swahili, nyumba ya jirani inachomeka. We must help. And they sent help in prayers, but they also sent their president to come and sit with us until the crisis was over. And I ask the leadership, who is going to go and sit with Congo until they hold their hands and say, until your house, the fire goes off. We sit with you, we try and find a solution. And the local people in Kenya and the rest of the countries around us, are we going to say our neighbor's house is on fire? We have to help them. Because if your house is on fire, people come and help you. But if you keep quiet about the fire in your neighbor's house, it spreads to your own house. So I'm saying let's look to ourselves for help, not look outside. I'm sure outside has not done a lot of good to our continent. We have a history of outside not being the best for us. Right from, we can go back from slavery and coming back to colonialism, coming back to now our nations that have been formed without our consent, without us being at the table. But how long will we remain victims? How long will we say, oh, this was done to us, this was done to us? It's time to get up and own your history and say, I'm not a victim of my history. And this I'm saying to the young people, it can be done. Right. It's time for us to move on. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Let's appreciate our panelists. Charity Kagwe, thank you so much. Dr. Lonzo and Rujira, Professor PLO Lumumba, and Dr. Fred Goloba Mutevi. I also want to urge all of us, do not learn about Rwanda just on the media. If you're here in Kenya, it's less than 2 hours flight to Kigali. And if you're going by bus, it's going to be a very fun road trip, around 24 hours enjoying the scenery. Come, visit Rwanda, see it for yourself. Visit the Gisozi Genocide Memorial, get the inside story for yourself, be able to understand all these things for yourself. I want to say thank you to the organizers, the High Commission. Let's appreciate the Rwanda High Commission in Rwanda. And all the partners, including yourselves who've been listening keenly. And at this point, I want to sign off. As always, my name is Eugene Anangwe. Take care of yourselves and see you soon.